Hey, what's up? It's Cute What If. This side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku had analytical skills. Now before we move ahead with the fic, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. All she needed was an opening. She'd been looking for one for a while, but now one had almost literally fallen into her lap. Although she was aware that many of her classmates found their accommodations rather sizable, to Momo Yaoyorozu the Heights Alliance dormitories were more similar to the quarters her family provided for their live-in staff. Still, she'd quickly grown to love it there, getting to live with all of her friends, not to mention having such easy access to all of UA's resources, had made the move invaluable, despite aesthetic challenges. She saw Minoru Minta's G-covered head watching her from the second-floor balcony out of the corner of her eye. A dark aura surrounding him as Drool SL Siken the floor, and living with the boys. In that moment, however, Tenya Ida raced down the hall, puffs of smoke spilling from the exhaust in his calves, and grabbed Minta by the collar, a lecture already streaming from his mouth. Well, some of them, anyway. Though living with the boys had led to the opportunity sitting before her. Tentatively, Momo stretched her hand toward the object resting on the black wooden coffee table. Her fingers grazed over the formerly white cover now splotched with grayed ink stains and fingerprints and the well-worn pages, frayed along the edges and bowing at the corners. She considered opening the cover, though she knew that would be a gross invasion of privacy. The temptation lingered. However, the cover's soft, pliable cardboard flexed as she thumbed the corner again and again. "What you got there, yeah, Momo?" A small squeak escaped Momo's throat. She clutched the notebook tight to her chin as her eyes snapped up to the other side of the table. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Momo, I didn't mean to startle you." Ochako Uraraka's padded fingertips pressed to her mouth, her eyebrows shooting up into her forehead. Momo shook her head, then cleared her throat. "It's all right, Ochako," she said, taking a steadying breath. She hadn't done anything wrong, she knew, but she could still understand why her nerves would be so tightly wound holding this particular item. She eyed the title, scrawled permanently black in both kanji and English, Hero Analysis, No. 15. Uraraka stepped to the side of the table, closer to where Momo sat on the couch. "Isn't that one of Deku's notebooks?" she asked. Clearing her throat a second time, Momo tucked a wayward lock of her long black hair behind her ear. "Yes, I found it stuffed between the cushions here," she said, gesturing to the space. "I imagine he must have been writing in it, then become distracted by something and set it down." A conspiratorial grin pushing toward her rosy cheeks, Uraraka sat beside her friend, her brown bob cut bouncing around her rounded face. "Are you going to read it?" she asked. "No," Momo gasped, a little louder than she intended. "Awa, come on," Uraraka said, scooting a little closer. "Not even a little peek." Momo's face flushed. "I will admit to having considered it," she said, looking down at the notebook again. "But no. I fear that would be like reading his diary." Uraraka nodded. "Yeah, I get that," she said. Their entire class knew of Izuku Midoriya's analytical skills, especially when it came to quirks, and his secrecy regarding his actual notebooks was just as legendary. The only other person who had ever held one had been Midoriya's former middle school classmate, Katsuki Bakugo, and that had only been to hit it with a small explosion and set it on fire. "Well, Bakugo and Momo, now. What are you going to do with it, then?" Uraraka asked. "I plan on returning it," Momo replied. "Do you happen to know where he is?" Uraraka gave her an ear-to-ear smile. "Oh, yeah, I saw him head out to train with Bakugo and All Might about half an hour ago." Momo's eyebrows stitched together. "Training? Now?" she asked, though it was more than a statement than a question. In a way, she wasn't surprised. "We've just taken our final exams." "You know Deku," Uraraka said. "He's always pushing himself to the limit. Bakugo, too." That was true. Even though they were only a few weeks away from starting their second year at UA, Midoriya was out there working, trying to improve even further. Momo looked around the dorms at their classmates. Mina Ashido, Tsuyu Asui, and a floating t-shirt and shorts indicated Toru Hagakure were in the kitchen, sitting at the island in the center munching on snacks. Her best friend Kyoka Jiro was on the other side of the common area with Denki Kaminari, each of them holding a guitar, Jiro attempting to teach him a few basic chords. Fumikichi Tokoyami had his beak buried in a book in the corner. Yuga Aoyama was with Koji Koda, Mashiro Ajiro, Hantasiro, and Rikido Sato, a whiteboard plastered with pictures of their hero costumes before them. Clearly Aoyama was attempting to discuss ways they could make their outfits flashier. The others were nowhere to be seen, though she knew Shoto Todoroki was visiting his mother. They were, all of them, good friends, and would one day become great heroes. But that drive, that single step beyond, Midoriya had exhibited it time and time again. on their first day of classes, nearly a year ago. Now, he'd had so little control over his own quirk that he'd broken a finger throwing a soft. Similarly, in fighting against Todoroki in their first sports festival, his power wrecked his body so badly that it had been difficult for him to move for the rest of the day. But then, after their internships, he'd come back, and had completely reworked his quirk in order for him to be able to use it without harming himself. Then, after breaking his arms again fighting the villain Muscular, he'd reworked his fighting style to relieve the stress on his arms. And now, in the finals they'd just taken, he'd been shooting blasts of air from the force of his fingers. He'd retooled a quirk he could barely control multiple times in the span of a single year. Uraraka stood from the couch, a smile on her face, her hand reaching out toward Momo. "Would you like me to take the notebook to him?" she asked. Momo rose from her seat, the book clutched close to her saint, and stood to her full height, nearly head and shoulders taller than Uraraka. "I appreciate it, but no, thank you," she said with a slight bow. "I will return it myself. I am the one who found it, after all." For a brief moment, Momo noticed Uraraka's face fall, before it perked up again. "Okay, well, I think I heard them mention they were heading to Gym Gamma, so you might be able to catch them there." "Thank you, Achako," Momo said, bowing again before taking her leave. As she stepped around the couch, Momo noticed the concerned expression that crossed Uraraka's features. Just as quickly, however, Uraraka's smile returned, and Momo heard the girl kick her feet up onto the coffee table and turn on the television. Momo pulled a thin blue hoodie over her shoulders as she walked out the door of the Heights Alliance, Midoriya's notebook tucked under her arm, the opening she'd been hoping for since before their final exams. Midoriya. XXXXXX. "Come on, you damn nerd, quit wasting my time." Izuku would have said Bakugo's shouting was ringing in his ears, if it weren't for the tinnitus already there from the explosions. "I'm not finished yet, Kakin," he shouted, rebounding from where he'd fallen on the ground and shooting across the room in a second. Green lightning lanced its way around his body as he charged power through his muscles. "I could deaden the flames Kakin generates with his explosions with an air blast, but the real danger from an explosion isn't the fire or the heat, it's the concussive force, and an air blast hitting one would just cause further damage. I've got to think of something else." Bakugo, however, was not about to allow Izuku the opportunity to plan. He blasted himself forward, running his hand along the concrete floor of the gym. Chips of shrapnel fired toward Izuku as Bakugo brought his hand up, along with the fire and boom. Izuku covered his face with his arms and dove to the side. His forearms burned from both the heat and the sharp stones slicing into his skin. Blood smeared the ground where Izuku fell, but he used the momentum from his fall to twist his body back around and kick out. He caught Bakugo in the scent, sending the boy flying across the gym and negating his follow-up attack. Both boys were slow to rise. Bakugo laid propped up on one arm, his other clutching his sin as he tried to gather up breath. Izuku had rolled onto his stomach, blood from his wounds trickling down onto the floor as he tried to push himself up. Young Bakugo, All Might's voice was still powerful, despite his weakened, diminutive form, and carried echoes in the hollow concrete of Gym Gamma. "Your attack might have been effective, but using shrapnel like that in training is dangerous." Another few moments passed as Bakugo sucked in air. Finally, he stared at All Might, red eyes glaring through the ash-blonde spikes of his hair. "You just said it was effective," he rose, wiping spittle from the side of his mouth. "If Deku can't handle it, he shouldn't be here." Izuku flinched. He was on his knees now, sweat dripping down from his nose, mingling with the two small pools of blood beneath his palms. He may not have liked it, but he knew that Kakin was right. It wasn't like the villains were going to take it easy on them. They couldn't afford to be lax in their training. Before Izuku could speak, however, All Might's voice blared through the empty gym. "You'll notice, young Bakugo," he said, "that he handled it just fine. But we're not trying to spill blood out here." "He'll heal," Bakugo spat, wincing as he tried to take a step. "Eyes don't recover as easily as other parts of the body," All Might said, clapping Bakugo on the shoulder. "And, judging by how you're moving right now, I'd say you probably need a little bit of recovery yourself." Bakugo scoffed, but on his next inhale he wheezed, and All Might launched into a guffaw that carried a sprinkling of blood with it. "Go see Recovery Girl," he said. "We'll call this one a draw." Izuku knew that wouldn't sit well, and he was absolutely right. "Like hell," Bakugo shouted, shoving All Might to the side. "Stand up and fight, Deku. I'm not finished with you yet." Small explosions detonated in Bakugo's palm as he loomed over Izuku. Determination lived in his old friend's blood, but as Izuku looked up, a tear in Bakugo's shirt revealed a massive bruise sprawling across his scent, the yellow and purple-black of serious damage. "Kakin will never willingly admit defeat. With those injuries, I could probably beat him, But how much worse will it get before he's down? So Izuku shook his head and said, I can't. Bakugo scoffed and tried to stand up straighter, but stopped just shy of his full height. Izuku saw the briefest expression of pain flash across his face. I'm starting to think this is a waste of my time, Bakugo said, turning toward the exit. After a few steps he paused, shifting to glance over his shoulder. Be better, he said, his voice softer than usual. Or there's no point. As Bakugo shuffled toward the door, Izuku looked to All Might. Shining blue eyes bored into him from their sunken depths, and Izuku was forced to look away from his mentor, back down to the drying blood on the concrete. A long, thin shadow crossed over him as All Might approached. For the briefest moment, Izuku saw a flash of the faded vestige of his predecessor he'd seen his dreams, rather than a simple shadow. You lied, All Might said, his voice low. It wasn't something Izuku was usually good at. I couldn't let Kaken keep fighting with those injuries. I know why you did it, All Might said, kneeling to place a hand on Izuku's shoulder. But you're both training to be heroes. Besides, he rose, extending a hand so Izuku could do the same. Isn't that a little hypocritical, coming from you? They shared a laugh, and All Might clapped Izuku on the back. Come on, let's get you. Out of my way, Ponytail, they heard Bakugo shout from the other side of the gym. Izuku turned toward the exit, and saw Yaoyorozu in the doorway. Bakugo was still hunched over, a hand clutching at his Saint, the other forearm pressing against Yaoyorozu's shoulders as he shoved his way past her. Her mouth hung open in a small oval, but her eyebrows furrowed, and she watched Bakugo stomp off briefly before shaking her head. Young Yaoyorozu, All Might called, waving to her. Izuku felt the heat rise in his face as Yaoyorozu approached. His usual response to any girl, really, but with Yaoyorozu it felt different. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. With some of his other classmates, like Uraraka or Ashido, he'd grown more comfortable, able to hold friendly conversations and witty banter. He'd even throw in a joke every now and again. But with Yaoyorozu that just hadn't happened. She'd always seemed distant to him. That's just how things were. Maybe that's how they would stay. Maybe that's how they were supposed to be. What can I do for you today? All Might asked, after Yaoyorozu greeted them with a bow. Izuku divested himself from All Might, giving each of them a polite nod. I'll see you later, All Might. Yaoyorozu, he said, turning toward the door. Wait, Yaoyorozu shouted, her hand gripping his arm. Wincing, Izuku jerked away from her out of reflex, and she looked at her palm, to the secant red blood there. My goodness, Midoriya, what happened to your arms? Did you hurt yourself again? I thought you had more control over your quirk now. As she spoke, rolls of gauze began to tumble out of the glowing skin near her collarbone, where her white tank top dipped slightly. She handed these to All Might, then held one hand against the small of her back, while the other lifted her shirt and hoodie. Izuku felt his face get hotter. A bottle of hydrogen peroxide appeared in her hand, along with a white cloth. She opened the bottle and saturated the cloth, then paused. Oh, I'm sorry, she said, a free hand covering her mouth. I should have asked your permission beforehand. Please forgive me. Her politeness exceeded even his own, and Izuku found himself smiling. He shook his head. It's all right, he said, extending his arms for her. Thank you. Yaoyorozu cleaned the wounds, then took the gauze from All Might and began to wrap Izuku's forearms. How did this happen? She asked. Just some cuts from training with Kaken, Izuku replied. A smile crossed his face again. Nothing I did to myself this time. She smiled back at him. Izuku's breath hitched in his throat for a second. Well, that's good to hear, she said, her voice peppered with the lilt of good humor. Were they talking? Holding conversation. Holy crap. Yaoyorozu had finished with his left and moved on to his right. Her hands stumbled as they crossed over the scars on his hand, and Izuku's face fell. He almost wanted to pull back, but he let her continue. All Might said. Was there something you needed from me, young Yaoyorozu? Oh, well, actually, Yaoyorozu started. As she finished tying off Izuku's bandages, he saw her reach for something tucked underneath her arm. Something that apparently used to be white. Something that looked vaguely like... Oh, no. I was hoping to talk to Midoriya, she said, holding out his notebook. She read it. Oh, crap, she read it. And now my whole life is over. I'll have to move. I'll have to switch schools. All Might coughed, the sound accompanied with bloody spittle. Right, well, then, he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, I guess I'll be on my way. He clapped a hand on Izuku's back. Good work today, young Midoriya. I'll see you later. And with a polite nod to Yaoyorozu, which she returned in kind, he left the gym. And left Izuku to his fate. So, Yaoyorozu began, pausing as her face flushed. I'm dead. I found this in the couch cushions in the common room, she continued, holding the notebook out to him. Izuku took it with shaking fingers. Thank you, he said, his voice just as tremulous. I've been looking for this for a few days. Truth be told, he'd been tearing his room and the dorms upside down searching for it for the past few days, but she didn't need to know that. I'm glad I was able to return it to you, she said, her eyebrows upturned, a finger drifting around her lips. She hadn't looked at his face since she'd finished bandaging his arms, instead glancing to the space All Might had just vacated. The pleasantries were out of the way. Now, all that remained was for her to drop the hammer blow, to reveal she'd read the contents of the notebook. Moments passed in silence. Sweat rolled down Izuku's back. He said finally, scratching the back of his head. Well, thank you, again, I really appreciate it. He turned to leave, hoping that she was too embarrassed to discuss the notebook with him, that maybe she was just willing to leave it alone. It was too much to hope that she hadn't read it at all. He was so secretive with them, the temptation would be too great for anyone. Yaoyorozu stepped in front of him, a sudden fierceness in her features. She was several inches taller than he, enough so that when she stuck out her upraised palm to stop him, it was level with his face. Wait, she said, her voice strong. I had something I needed to discuss with you. Here it was. The inevitable end of his future at UA. All Might would have to sneak around to train him, assuming he still wanted to at all. Oh, really, he said, the stutter in his voice making him nearly unintelligible. Never mind his usual nervousness around girls, this pressure was too much. He thought his heart might explode. Whatever could that be? Yaoyorozu lowered her palm to her side, her face scrunched together tight, a look of revulsion. I knew it. I'm done for. Instead, she bowed to him again. The tips of the high pull of her ponytail tickled his nose. Izuku Midoriya, she said, I need your help. What? Midoriya's voice came out garbled. Momo could barely piece together what he'd said. She rose, her eyes examining his features. His face was a shade of reddish pink she hadn't previously known existed, and was shining with sweat. Whether this was from his embarrassment or his earlier training with Bakugo, she didn't know. His eyes were wide, but bright, and his eyebrows were pushing into the green hair matted to his forehead. He had a white knuckle grip on the notebook she'd returned, his right hand pulled tight around the upper corner as he hugged it to his Saint, the scars there nearly invisible from the tightness of his hold. Momo's eyes paused on those scars, remembering how they'd felt on her fingertips as she'd been tying his bandages. Rough lines of skin on either side of his palm, a marked contrast to the hand around them. His fingers, as well, were gnarled, damaged, healed, and functional, but still distinct from his other hand. They were a reminder of his determination, his unbreakable drive to better himself. One of the main reasons she needed him. She reoriented herself, and tried to push down the flush rising in her face. Yes, she'd had to grab his hand, but it was only to bandage his wounds. Midoriya, Momo started again, closing her eyes and placing a hand over her heart. I would like to ask for your help. Repeating herself seemed to snap Midoriya out of his embarrassment. He looked left and right, as if he expected someone else to be watching them from the shadows. What could you need my help with? Now it was her turn to become flustered. She hated this. She hated the fact that she couldn't help but compare herself to her classmates, to find herself wanting. She hated feeling like she needed help. But she couldn't think of any other way to improve. She needed fresh eyes. I feel like I'm falling behind, Momo said, her voice, though barely above a whisper, echoing in the concrete chamber. After our final exams last week, I saw so much improvement from everyone, her face fell. Except for myself. Midoriya's mouth hung open slightly, his eyebrows knitted together tight. What? The test was so difficult for me, I barely managed to make it through. For their final exam of the year, the students of Class 1 had been put into 1-on-2 battles against their classmates, specifically those who held considerable advantages over their peers in terms of quirks. The solo student's objective was to find a way to escape, or to survive 15 minutes, by which point, it was determined, help would have arrived. The pair of villains simply had to capture their opponent before the time limit was up. Momo had been set against Ida and Kirishima, the former due to his speed, the idea being that he would be able to capture her before she had enough time to create anything that could slow him down, and the latter because his strongening quirk would allow him to plow his way through any traps she might set if Ida should fail. The only reason she'd passed was because neither of them had anticipated her hiding down a long corridor. Kirishima had gone first, as planned, but Momo's first trap was a gas grenade filled with tranquilizer. While the filters in Ida's helmet had protected him, Kirishima collapsed rather quickly. The rest of Momo's traps, however, had all been designed to prevent Ida from using his speed. The result was that, by the time Ida reached the room where Momo was hiding, there was barely a minute left on the timer, and she managed to hold him off with some well-placed riot shields and her bow staff. It was not what she would have considered a decisive victory. If it had been a real fight, she never would have been able to escape that room. Midoriya, on the other hand, had been put up against Bakugo and Todoroki, objectively the three strongest students in the class. He'd forced Todoroki to keep his focus on the exits by using his enhanced speed to run between the three different doors. Finally, with 2 minutes remaining, Todoroki froze all the exits, and with Bakugo constantly chasing him down, Midoriya was left with no choice but to meet them out in the open. He fought them to a standstill. With 30 seconds remaining, Todoroki managed to freeze his arms and torso, and it looked like he was about to lose. Bakugo moved in to bind his legs and secure their victory, but instead Midoriya goaded him into launching another explosion, the heat from which weakened the ice enough for Midoriya to break free. With a final shout and a green flash of energy, he kicked out, throwing a blast of air down the street, and sending both of his opponents flying. The buzzer sounded just as Bakugo and Todoroki had been recovering. Momo shook her head, trying to relieve herself of the memories of her performance. She just needed to be better. Yaoyorozu, she heard Midoriya say her name, but the sound didn't fully register. Hot tears stung in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. That's why You were amazing. What? She said, snapping out of her reverie. She looked back to Midoriya, and saw that his face was set, his eyebrows low above his eyes, his mouth downturned in a slight frown. He'd carried the same look both before they'd rescued Bakugo, and just before the start of their provisional licensing exam. You were amazing, Midoriya repeated, his face brightening with energy. The way you knew they would send Kirishima in first, so you thought of something that could get past his strongening. It was awesome. And then making sure Ida kept tripping himself up getting down the corridor. It was a perfect strategy. Momo shook her head again. No, if it had been a real fight and not an exam. But it wasn't, Midoriya said. You acted within the parameters provided. I'm sure if the situation had been different, you would have come up with a different solution. I'm not, Momo almost shouted, and immediately caught herself. Midoriya was taken aback by her outburst. She saw him retreat from her, as though her words had pushed him back a step. With a breath, Momo tried to regain her composure. She closed her eyes and clutched a fist tight over her scent, pausing to choose her next words carefully. You are very kind, Midoriya, she said, her eyes opening again, not to look at him, but at the stone beneath their feet. But I have trouble believing you. Her head snapped up, and she looked in his eyes. A bright shade of green. She remembered reading somewhere that green eyes were a rarity in the pre-quirk era. Midoriya looked away first, down to the concrete that seemed to be so interesting to them both. I don't know how I can be of help to you, he said, the air in his voice so light it pushed away any possibility of echo. Momo took a step forward, bridging some of the space between them. My quirk, she started, twisting her fingertips in the grips of her other hand. It should be versatile. But I feel like I always end up relying on others. She nodded toward the notebook in his arms. I was hoping you might have some insight. I don't know anyone else who's studied quirks and their applications as much as you have. Wait, he said, looking up into her eyes. You mean you didn't? Read your notebook? Momo asked, slightly taken aback that he would consider it. No, of course not. I would never invade someone's privacy like that. His face fell. I'm sorry, he said. I guess I just thought. It's all right, Momo said, shaking her head at him. I understand. Heartbeats passed between them, slow at first, then faster, pulsing at the base of her neck. Midoriya reached up and scratched the back of his head. She tried not to notice the size of his arm. So, she said, stamping down on the heat rising in her face. Instead, she tapped the spine of the notebook. Anything in there that might be able to help me? Midoriya turned a shade of red that, when contrasted with his green hair, made him most closely resemble a tomato. Momo found herself unable to stop the light chuckle that grew in her sin as she smiled down at him. Not this one, necessarily, but he grinned back at her, a genuine look, and one that she found warm. I might have a few ideas. A squeal escaped Momo's lips, and she clapped her hands together before placing them to her sides and bowing to him slightly. Thank you so much, Midoriya, I greatly appreciate it. You're welcome, Yaoyorozu, he replied, scratching at the back of his head again. Honestly, I'm looking forward to it. Your quirk has so many potential applications, after all. I'm glad to see you're taking this seriously, she said, a grin pulling at the edges of her voice. She gestured to the door, taking a step in that direction. Shall we? Midoriya followed, and they exited the gym together. The trek back to the dorms would take them several minutes, and Momo was loath to let it pass between them in silence. There was something she had been wanting to know anyway. Midoriya, she said, her voice uncertain. May I ask you something? He smiled at her again. Of course, he said. Your notebooks, she said, are they just your notes on heroes? A finger scratched at his cheek. Well, not entirely, he replied, but pretty much, yeah. How long have you been keeping them? Since I learned how to write. Momo took a breath. That surely couldn't have been long after he'd discovered his quirk. I've wanted to be a hero my whole life, he continued, his voice low as they walked. But my quirk, it manifested a little bit later than most people, and, well, you saw what it could do to my body. He scratched at the back of his head again, and a small laugh escaped his saint. The first time I used it, I shattered my arm. Momo gasped, her hand flying in front of her mouth. What? How? Midoriya laughed again, the freckles on his cheeks glowing pink. I was playing All Might. She laughed with him. I feel like I should have seen that coming. How did it happen? I was maybe 5, he started. His eyes and face lit up as he told her the story. I was in the small yard behind my apartment, wearing an All Might hoodie, and I was pretending I was fighting a villain. I rushed forward with all my childhood strength, acted like I was charging up a Detroit smash, and, well... Green lightning danced around Midoriya's arm briefly, then carried down to his fingers. He raised his hand, his middle finger held down by his thumb, before he released them both. The grass and trees beside the walkway blew sideways for a moment from the strength of the straight-line winds that blasted from his fingertips. Momo had to tuck several errant strands of black hair back behind her ear. He glanced back at her. It was only about that strong, but at that age I was lucky my arm didn't fly off. Momo stared at him. It had been so long since they'd seen Midoriya hurting himself with his quirk, it was difficult to remember just how much power he really had. How much power he had to keep contained. Did you keep trying over the years? She asked. He shook his head. The doctors told me not to, he replied. It was too dangerous, after that day. Tears shone in his eyes, briefly, before he pinched the bridge of his nose. I lived my life quirkless. Momo knew what that meant. She might have attended a prestigious, expensive private middle school, but there were still quirkless kids, few and far between, but they were there all the same, and she'd seen how they were treated. It was subtler, in her school, but she'd noticed how they all would eat lunch together at the same table, regardless of year, or how quirkless kids always seemed to be the last ones chosen for gym activities, or to represent the class by the teachers. She couldn't imagine what it might have been like in a public school. Which is kind of where the notebooks came in, he continued. She was thankful that he'd changed the subject. She knew she wanted to say something about his past, some words of comfort, but she didn't know what they could be. So instead she filed the information away, just grateful to be learning something about her classmate. They paused outside the door to the dorms long enough for him to open it for her, to which she nodded her thanks. I wanted to learn as much as I could about quirks and heroes, and I took notes as I studied, he said as they proceeded into the kitchen, where Momo took a bottle of water from the refrigerator and handed it to him, grabbing an orange juice for herself. They seated themselves on stools around the island in the center. I can't imagine those early ones were very detailed, she said, opening the bottle and taking a drink. Midoriya chuckled into his water, and had to wipe some away from his mouth with his forearm. No, they weren't, he said. I'm pretty sure the first one is just a bunch of crayon drawings of All Might, but I wanted to keep them all. His eyes became distant, a small smile crossing his features. They're good memories. Momo noted how sad his smile seemed. She imagined, and worried, that his memories of studying heroes, of pursuing his dream of becoming a hero himself, might be some of the only good ones he had. For herself, her entire childhood had been filled with good memories. Loving parents, great friends at school. In fact, her only troublesome memories were ones here at UA. Ever since she'd lost to Takoyami in their first sports festival, she'd been doubting herself. She knew her quirk was strong, or at least it should be. Its only limitations were the physical barriers of the universe and her own imagination. But somehow she was stuck. Whenever she found herself in a fight, she would end up making defensive options for her friends, shields or barricades, and then maybe a cannon or her bow staff. She was rarely if ever proactive, and almost never went on the offensive. She kept relying on others and their quirks to get her out of trouble. And it was time that stopped. If that meant having Midoriya help her come up with some new ideas, then so be it. Maybe it would mean that, in the heat of battle, she might be able to be a bit more creative. She was called Creati, after all. So, she said, finishing her drink, when would you like to get started? Midoriya looked down at the table, the only sound in the room for a few moments the hum of the refrigerator. Give me a little while to think of something, he said finally, his eyes locking on her own. Would tomorrow morning be okay? Yes, that's perfect, Midoriya, thank you. On reflex, Momo grabbed his hand and squeezed, and felt the pressure in her fingers as he did the same. She smiled at him, a gesture she hoped conveyed just how grateful she was. A breath passed before Momo realized where her hands were. A small squeak escaped her throat, and she snatched her hands back as though his were the eyes of a hot stove. Midoriya, for his part, just kept growing redder in the face. He was giving the fruit bowl on the counter a 1,000-yard stare, as though the assortment of GS, spotted bananas, and various colors of apple held the key to the secrets of the universe. Well, she said, stepping around the kitchen island. She paused in the archway, turning back into the room. Midoriya was still contemplating the mysteries of the fruit bowl. Thank you again, she said with a polite nod. I suppose I'll meet you in the morning. The question seemed to break him out of his trance, as his body visibly snapped to attention upon being addressed. Oh, yes, he said, nodding at her with such speed and severity that she feared for the integrity of his neck. Still, she felt a smile inch its way onto her face, and a hand moved up to cover it. I'll meet you in the common room. Is 9 o'clock okay? Momo's smile stayed as she tilted her head. Yes. I'll see you in the morning. She bowed again, her eyes closed. Good night, Midoriya. Good night, Yaoyorozu, he replied with a bow in kind, as much as he could manage without falling off his stool. As she walked toward the elevator, Momo couldn't stop grinning. Elation like she'd never know coursed through her, tingling into her fingertips. She almost skipped to the elevator, but managed to keep her composure. She passed Mina Ashido on the way, who extended an invitation to join the rest of the girls for a movie night. Momo politely declined, however, citing the need to rise early the next morning. Tomorrow. The elevator doors closed before her, the electric hum of the machine melding with her thoughts. No more standing still. Tomorrow I finally start taking steps forward again. Izuku pulled his notebook out from underneath his arm, his fingers grazing over the spine. He knew what it was Yaoyorozu was asking for, but being able to deliver was something else entirely. She wanted his advice, his guidance in the potential of her quirk. It wasn't that he didn't have ideas, far from it. But he had no way of knowing if they would be helpful. He wasn't a pro, and he certainly wasn't a teacher. It would have served her far better to ask Mr. Aizawa, or All Might, for help. So why had she asked him? Had she really not read the notebook? He ran his hands over the cover. She said she didn't. And I trust her. Besides, if she'd read this one, her questions would have been quite a bit different. He thumbed the pages to the middle, preparing to break the spine until he heard raucous laughter coming from the common room, followed by a pair of approaching voices. He slid off the stool, finishing his bottle of water, and tossed the remains in the recycling before opening the pantry. Oh, hey there, Midori, Ashido said as she and Uraraka entered the kitchen. She plopped onto a stool, propping her elbows on the island, her chin in her palms. Whatcha up to? Izuku rummaged through the snack food, searching for a decent source of protein. He had just finished a workout, even if it ended prematurely. He found it in a bag of deshelled peanuts, popping one in his mouth as he turned around. Just a quick snack before I head upstairs, he said, tossing in 2 more peanuts. Uraraka was waiting to search the pantry herself, so Izuku stepped to the side. What about you guys? We're having movie night. Ashido pumped a fist into the air, leaving her oddly balanced on the stool before she caught herself. So Chaco and I volunteered to make popcorn. Oh, right, the bowl. She dropped off the stool and started digging through random cabinets. Sounds like fun, Izuku said, sweeping his notebook off the countertop. Uraraka stepped out of the pantry, her arms filled with bags of Instant Pop. She dropped these on the counter next to the microwave, where Ashido had placed an obnoxiously large glass bowl. Her eyes darted down to the notebook in Izuku's hand. Hey, you got your notes back, Deku. I guess Momo found you then, huh? Izuku's eyes widened, but then he remembered he'd seen Uraraka earlier as he, Kaken, and All Might had been walking out. Oh, you must have told her where we were, he said, to which Uraraka nodded. She did, yes. Thank you. The first bag started popping, the sound jarring against the soft hum of the microwave. Uraraka scratched at the back of her neck, her eyes focused on a corner of the kitchen island. So, she started, managing to look to Izuku's nose. Do you want to join us? Hey, Ashido said, bumping Uraraka with her elbow. Tonight was supposed to be girls' night. No offense, Midori. Well, Uraraka pushed her index fingers together. I just thought it might be nice to have everyone there. We could go ask the rest of the boys, too. Ashido considered this for a moment, her hand on her chin, her mouth scrunched into the side of her cheek. Finally, she brightened, a fist clapping into her palm. Yeah, that sounds great. We'll have to make more popcorn, though. She dove into another cabinet and pulled out a second massive bowl. So, how about it, Deku? Uraraka's rosy smile returned. Wanna join us? The notebook weighed heavy in Izuku's hand. Movie night did sound like fun, but he'd made Yaoyorozu a promise. She'd asked for his help. He wouldn't ignore that. Sorry, he said. I'd like to, but I've got some work to do tonight, and an early morning tomorrow. You know, Ashido said between fistfuls of popcorn, her voice full of mischief. I saw Momo a few minutes ago, and she said almost the exact same thing. Her black and amber eyes narrowed, and she tilted her head to one side, a snarky grin on her face. So, Midori, you and Momo got plans together tomorrow. Heat rose in Izuku's face like Endeavor himself had lit a bonfire in his neck with gasoline and napalm. His hands waved frantically in front of his crimson face. What? No? Yes, but... The notebook slipped from his grasp, and he fumbled it several times before catching it between his forearms. It's not like that. She did kind of make it seem like she wanted to talk to you. Uraraka's voice was soft, her eyes locked on where she was pouring popcorn into the bowl. Was it something important? Maybe we can help. Izuku was still trying to settle his notebook back into an actual hand. Important? No, it is, but... He paused, and took a steadying breath. His hand moved to the back of his head. She just asked me to help her train, that's all. Uraraka's face visibly brightened. Training. That's it? Ashido, on the other hand, deflated, tossing another piece of popcorn in her mouth. You guys sure aren't ones to waste time, huh? It's not a bad idea, though, Uraraka said, her index finger tapping against her chin. Ashido replaced another bag in the microwave. It is for me, she said. I plan on using these next few weeks to, relax. She handed a full bowl to Uraraka, then dumped a bag into the second. Come on, Chaco, let's go talk to the guys. We can grab the rest of this when we're done. She punched Izuku lightly on the shoulder as she walked past. Catch you later, Midori. Good luck with your training. Uraraka stepped around him, her arms not quite reaching each other around the circumference of the bowl. She struggled with her grip for a few seconds. Finally, she sighed, and a pink glow shone around the bowl. With her zero-gravity quirk activated, she gripped the lip of the bowl with one hand. Well, I'm sorry you can't join us tonight, Deku, she said, heading to the doorway. But good luck tomorrow. Thanks, Izuku said, watching her leave. The microwave dinged, and Izuku poured the completed bag into the bowl before replacing it. He picked up his notebook, grabbed a juice from the refrigerator, and left the kitchen, moving toward the elevator. XXXXXX. Colors assaulted Izuku as he stepped into his room. The red, white, and blue of his curtains, the flashes of yellow throughout the posters on his walls, the blue and white glaring up at him from the rug on the floor. Color was everywhere in Izuku's dorm room, primary and bright. Aside from the low hum of the air conditioner set into the ceiling, the room was quiet. The door gave a light CLCK as he closed it behind him, and he was left with the scent of cleanser and the faint hint of his deodorant. Izuku was not a slob by any means, but at the moment the room was less than tidy. His mother would not be pleased if she saw it. The reason for that dishevelment rested in his hand. Izuku placed the notebook on his desk, along with the juice. He'd been terrified that he'd lost this volume in particular. Yes, it would be bad and embarrassing should he have lost one of the others, especially if it was one of the two that he'd filled since coming to UA Forget Villains. If his classmates saw his notes on each of them, along with his accompanying drawings, the mortification might be enough to kill him on the spot. This latest volume, however, he'd only named it such in order to make it seem innocuous. Just Midoriya being Midoriya, more volumes of hero notes. And for this book, that was slightly true. Just that the heroes in question were all very specific. He sat down at his desk and opened the cover. On the first page was a self-portrait, himself in his costume, sans mask, though only from above his shoulders. He wasn't sure he'd captured himself correctly, but it was the best he could do. Above his head was written the number 9, and beneath that, his name. On the next page was All Might, though it would be difficult to tell from the image. It was blurred and distant, as though he had been trying to draw what All Might would look like through fire. Above his head was the number 8 inches and his given name, which Izuku never liked to use, Toshinori Yagi. Following All Might was a dark-haired woman, her face glowing with a smile. Number 7, he said. Nana Shimura. Beautiful, Izuku felt, though there was something in her eyes that seemed sad. Several resemblances struck him as he looked at the picture, now, the first of which being how much she looked like Yaoyorozu. They just both have dark hair, and both pull it into a ponytail, he said. The second was to her grandson, the leader of what had formerly been the League of Villains, successor to All for One, the man who had created One for All, the quirk Izuku had inherited from All Might, the monster who had nearly defeated All Might in Kamino Ward, and cost the world's greatest hero the remains of his power. There was no describing the evils done to the boy who had once been Tenko Shimura, or the evils committed by the man Tamura Shigaraki. Izuku simultaneously felt rage and pity when he thought of his adversary, and he didn't know if those thoughts would ever change. The last resemblance was to his mother. All Might had made a comment the first time he'd met Izuku Midoriya, about how she reminded him of his old master. It's the hairstyle, he'd said, though Izuku hadn't been able to tell if he was joking or not. To him, they seemed to have more in common than a ponytail, but neither could he put a finger on what it was. Beneath her portrait, Izuku had written, "Quirk, float." On the next page, beneath the number 6, was a picture of a dark-haired man in a high-collared jacket, buttons running down the collar and into the body of the jacket itself. He had no name, and an unknown quirk. For number 5, however, there was a picture of a shirtless bald man with goggles resting on his forehead, a lantern jaw and kind eyes. His name was Dagoro Banjo, and his quirk was called Black Whip. Izuku had used this power a number of times now, most notably during its initial manifestation in the battle trial with Class B, and during his work study with Endeavor, when he'd saved several people whose vehicles had been thrown into the air. And so it went, each page another of his predecessors. Another man with 2 massively long scars over his left eye, others of whom he'd had yet to see anything more than outlines, he didn't even know where they fit in the timeline. Until he reached the first. There was no name, not one that he knew. But Izuku knew well who this man was. All for One's brother. The one for whom One for All had been created. Shoulder-length white hair that covered his left eye, and a frail physique. But a heart that had stood up to his brother during All for One's rise to power. A heart that was everything that being a wielder of this power meant. Izuku was proud to list them as predecessors, and hoped he could live up to their expectations. The next pages were his own notes and questions about his power. Some had been answered during his dreams, where he'd seen the vestiges of his progenitors and sometimes been able to talk to them. Others had been answered by All Might, with what knowledge the hero had been able to glean himself, and what he'd been taught by Nana Shimura. But more still remained, questions that could only be answered with time, or trial and error, which Izuku was not thrilled by. Given that One for All could cost him the use of his body, he didn't exactly have a plethora of opportunities available to just try things out. Izuku was determined to master this quirk, and all of the other powers that came with it. And he believed the only way to do that was to have as much knowledge as possible about One for All, and what it held within. Yes, it was good that Yaoyorozu had been the one to find this particular volume. He couldn't imagine any of his classmates, aside from perhaps Ida or Todoroki, avoiding the temptation to look inside. And, considering what he'd promised her, Izuku didn't have much time to look into his own quirk right then. So he closed volume 15 and slid it into place on the small shelf above his desk, then pulled volume 14, the one he'd started after meeting all of his classmates in Class A. He opened the notebook and started flipping through the pages. Some of his friends had more than others, but when he reached Yaoyorozu, he realized he'd forgotten how much of the book had been dedicated to her. After his initial sketch of her hero costume, he had roughly 12 pages of notes front and back to peruse. As he started reading, he also realized he'd forgotten to update these notes as their first year went on, which meant he'd been ignoring all the progress they'd made. Pulling a pen and some paper from his desk drawer, Izuku sighed, stretched his neck, and cracked open the juice bottle. "All right," he said, tapping the paper with his pen, "let's get to work." Momo bounced on the S of her feet, her hand gripping the back of the couch. Her eyes snapped to the clock on the wall. 9:03, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You gotta relax," Kyoka Jiro's voice came from the other side of the couch. Momo looked down to see her best friend munching on a bowl full of dry cereal, one finger twirling the jack that dangled as part of her earlobe. Kyoka looked up as she saw her friend's nervous expression. "So he's a little late. Big deal. Midoriya's probably the most dependable guy in class." The clock ticked down another minute. Momo's lip pulled from between her teeth, and her forehead was beginning to ache from how strong her eyebrows were pushing together. "Are you sure?" Kyoka sat up, her elbows pushing against the armrest. "Do you remember the school festival? We were all freaking out because we couldn't find him, and where was he? Fighting a pair of villains. By himself, and he still made it back in time for us to go on, even though his only job was to dance around some and hoist Aoyama up like a pinata. Momo had to smile at that. Playing that show for the rest of their school had been an incredible time, capped off by watching Aoyama swing above the crowd, his navel laser reflecting and refracting, a sparkling mirror in a rainbow of spotlights. Point being, Kyoka said, settling back down on the couch, her hand digging around in the cereal bowl again. If Midoriya says he'll be here, I doubt anything short of the League themselves would be able to stop him. A twitch ran up Momo's spine. The League of Villains had been quiet for a while. The official line stated that they had been having a power struggle since All Might defeated their leader in Kamino Ward, but whispers had them bolstering their ranks, preparing for some new offensive. Either way, Momo had seen their ruthlessness firsthand on multiple occasions, their unveiling at the attack on the SG, their kidnapping of Bakugo during the summer training camp, she and Midoriya along with Ida, Todoroki, and Kirishima rescuing Bakugo during the Kamino Ward incident. They were neither foolish nor merciful. Their plans thus far had been careful and nearly flawless. Put simply, they were dangerous. Which was just another reason why she needed to improve. A chime sounded. Midoriya was now 5 minutes late, and Momo's threadbare patience snapped. She walked over to the elevator and pressed the button, and watched the car slide down the glass tube from the second floor. The doors started to open, and in her haste Momo stepped forward before they were fully parted. Unfortunately, the car's occupant had done the same, and their forehead collided with Momo's. The pain was pinpoint and instant, and she heard a cry escape her lips as she staggered back. Before she could fall, however, a rough hand gripped her around the forearm, and she was able to regain her balance. "Oh, I'm sorry, Yaoyorozu," Midoriya winced, his other hand pressing into his green hair. Papers collapsed in a heap beneath him, but he seemed not to notice. "Are you okay?" Her fingers prodded the spot where they bumped each other, just above her eyebrow. There was no blood, so most likely it would just leave a bump, or a small bruise, if anything. "Yes, I'm all right, thank you," she said, regaining her balance. "I was actually just coming to look for you." "Yeah, sorry about that," he said. His hand left her forearm to scratch at the back of his head. "I was making a couple calls, and one carried on a little long." He knelt down and started collecting his notes. Momo curled her arms into herself, placing a hand over where his had just been. "That's all right," she said, trying to calm herself from how stressed she'd been waiting for him. She joined him on the ground, grabbing several papers to add to his stack. "Are you ready to get started?" she asked. Midoriya stood, notes once again in hand, and nodded, a smile crossing his features. "Sure," he said, walking toward the kitchen. "Just let me grab a breakfast bar and we'll be on our way." Momo headed back to the couch, where Kyoka's jacks were retracting from where they'd been pierced into the floor. "I told you he'd be here," Kyoka said as Momo approached, another handful of cereal on its way to her mouth. "You hush," Momo said, reaching down to grab some cereal herself. Midoriya emerged from the kitchen a moment later and exchanged pleasantries with Kyoka. "You ready?" he asked, turning to Momo. She nodded, and pulled on the jacket of her gym clothes. "Have fun, you guys," Kyoka said, one hand pulling out her phone while the other dug around in the cereal bowl. "Try not to work too strong, okay?" "We'll do our best," Momo said over her shoulder as Midoriya held the door open for her. They stepped out into the clear sunlight of the morning, and Momo fell into step beside Midoriya, who appeared to be trying to put his notes back in some kind of order, and was fumbling them terribly. "Would you like some help?" she asked, holding her hands out. "Huh?" Midoriya asked. 2 sheets of paper escaped the confines of his arms, drifting their way to freedom on the gentle breeze. He snatched them back up in a single motion, returning them to the others braced against his scent. "Oh, no, thank you. I've got it." His balance wavered, but he managed to hold on to small pile before any more could be caught up by the wind. Momo smiled and zipped her jacket halfway down, placing a hand over her sternum. Brightness shone from her scent, and a half-second later a 3-ring binder, green with accents of red, black, and white, emerged in her hand. "How about something to hold them in?" she asked, extending the binder to him. Midoriya braced the stack of paper against his scent and took the binder with his free hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet, a pink glow on his cheeks. He turned his face to her. "But I don't really have." She held out a single hole puncher, still glowing in the palm of her hand. "Oh, right," he said, hooking a pinky finger through the loop at the bottom of the puncher. An unbidden smile crossed her face as she watched his hands bungle everything they were trying to hold. Finally, he managed a truce with the various elements, with the binder under his arm, and the stack of notes pressed against his scent with his forearm. His hands remained free to sift through the pages and punch holes as they walked, though it looked cumbersome. Metallic CL seeking and the crunch of gravel were their only accompaniments for a few moments, until Midoriya got himself into a kind of rhythm. So before we really get started, he said, punching another hole, do you mind if I ask you something? Momo's heartbeat thumped behind her ears. Of course not, she replied, tucking back a loose strand of black hair. Ask away. Midoriya shifted the papers against his Saint. Well, first, he said, your quirk isn't able to make anything with organic matter, right? Not exactly, she replied, shaking her head. I can't make anything alive, but I could, for example, make something out of wood. He hummed a low note, then returned to punching holes in his notes, leaving Momo to wonder how that information could be relevant to his theories about her quirk. Okay, next question, he said after a moment. I've noticed, when you fight, you tend to create particular weapons, specifically a cannon, or your bow staff. Do you have a reason for doing so? Momo gaped at him for a half-second, then smiled. I didn't know you were watching so closely, she said, her voice quiet, almost fading into the breeze. Midoriya's face quickly turned the color of a cherry blossom. In the split second that followed, Momo realized how her words could be taken, and it became her turn to shift into a shade of red. No, that is, I just meant that, she paused, her volume dropping by octaves of uncertainty. I didn't think anyone was really paying attention. He paused outside the door to the gym, one hand on the door handle, his face pensive. His lips were pursed, and his eyes seemed keenly focused on a crack in the path. Then he looked up at her, and a half-smile crossed his features. Well, I wouldn't be much use to you if I hadn't been, would I? Momo closed her eyes and shook her head, but a grin was stretching her cheeks. No, she said, opening them just as Midoriya was pulling on the door. I suppose not. They walked through and found themselves facing a room full of sparring mats, exercise equipment, and free weights. The doors on the other side of the gym held specialized training areas for quirks that might endanger other students if they were used out in the open, as well as a massive pool, several rooms that simulated places villains frequently attacked, such as banks or convenience stores, and a shooting range. Several of their schoolmates were present, all at different stages of their workouts. Most were at varying machines in the exercise area, and 2 sparring mats had hand-to-hand matches being fought on them. Momo saw Hitoshi Shinso in the corner, who gave her a nod of recognition, though it was difficult to notice due to the capture weapon he wore around his neck. To answer your question, Momo said as Midoriya led them toward the racks of training equipment on the other side of the sparring mats. Yes, I do create those particular weapons for a reason, several, in fact. My bow staff is both simple to create, which means it takes almost no time, and I have been training in Bujutsu and Aikido since I was very young, so I am well versed in its use. They stopped in front of a punching bag. Midoriya used the opportunity to finally set down his notes and start putting them in the binder. And what about the cannon? He asked, without turning around. Momo blanched, scratching at a spot beneath her earlobe. Well, the cannon is just a relatively simple way to get a larger attack, she said. Compared to other long-range weapons that would give a similar impact, a cannon is a fairly simplistic construct. But it does take time, Midoriya said, turning around now that his notes were all squared away, both to create and to reload. She nodded. Yes. He flipped open the binder, then started patting at the pockets of his gym clothes. His head snapped around to where he'd left the hole puncher resting on a stool, and Momo realized what was wrong. When he turned back, she was holding out a point pen for him. Thanks, he said, his voice quiet, the blush on his cheeks hiding his freckles. You're welcome, she said, smiling. Let's see, he said, writing furiously. Okay, how about your creations? Do they dissipate or dissolve? And do they have to be fully formed when they leave your body? Momo shook her head. They don't wither. They're just as solid and real as anything else of their like, so long as I construct them properly. And they only have to be as complete as I want them to be. For example, if I need a blade to cut through a person's seatbelt, I don't need to construct a handle for it as well. However, once a creation is out of me, it cannot be retracted. Midoriya nodded, his hand flying across the paper. Momo was half convinced she saw green sparks snapping around his arm. So that blade would just be there with no safe way to retrieve it, he said. Yes, Momo replied, which is why I usually make fully functional creations. Making something for a one-time use is fairly inefficient. He hopped down off the stool and set the binder on it. Do me a favor, he said, standing behind the punching bag. Hit the bag. As strong as you can. She waited for him to hold the bag, but he never did, so she took her stance before it. In a single swift motion, her entire body weight shifted, and the bag collapsed in where she'd struck it before the force caused it to swing on its chain. Momo smiled to herself. She'd been out of practice for a little while, and it was good to see she hadn't rusted too much. Midoriya, however, was not smiling. His hand was on his chin, and a pinched frown sat beneath his finger. Finally, he looked up at her. "Can I show you something?" he asked. "Please," she said, gesturing to the bag. She picked up the binder and sat on the stool. He stood before the bag and shook out his arms. The green lightning of his quirk passed over his body, and with a single step forward, he threw what she knew was a sloppy and easily defensible punch at the bag, which proceeded to fly off its chain, slam into the back wall, and explode in a burst of sand. The noise of the gym quieted to a whisper. All eyes were on them as Midoriya turned back to her. "I thought your quirk didn't give you any kind of physical augmentations," he said. "I needed to be sure before we move forward." The gust of wind that had come after his attack had thrown her hair out of order, and Momo tried to tuck the unruly strands back into place. How much of your power was that?" she asked. Suddenly he was the bashful Midoriya she'd known all along again, staring down at the floor. "That's not really important," he said. But that wasn't who she needed. She needed his confidence, both in himself and his insights, and in her ability to overcome these hang-ups she was experiencing. "How much?" she asked him again. He shrugged and shook his head. "Maybe a tenth? I'm not sure." "A tenth. 10%. Why?" she asked. "The first thing I thought of last night was how, when you fight, you're basically quirkless." Her eyes widened, her jaw dropped. "I knew you had skill and technique. I could see that in the way you moved," he continued. "And with your quirk, you can make yourself all the tools you would need to be able to fight. But tools can only do so much. And they can all be broken." Her shoulders slumped. "So that's it, then?" Momo asked, her voice distant. "I should give up?" "What? No," Midoriya said. He knelt before her, looking into her downcast eyes. "There are plenty of heroes who fight that way. Our teacher is one of them, remember?" Momo nodded, slowly. "But Mr. Aizawa is able to level the field," she said. "So can you," he replied. "Mr. Aizawa doesn't level the field just with his quirk. He does it by fighting smart. And you're the smartest person I know." She smiled at him, grateful for his presence, for his overwhelming optimism. "What should I do?" she asked. He took her hand and stood, pulling her toward the special training areas in the back. His grip was strong, much firmer than Momo expected, and she didn't know if it was some kind of residual effect of his quirk on his skin, but there was definitely a tingling sensation in her hand where he was touching her. Her heartbeat thrummed behind her ears again, and heat rose up to her face from somewhere near her collarbone. "With your quirk, you essentially have to balance practicality, usefulness, and resources," Midoriya said as they pushed through the back doors into the special training area. "You make a cannon, and it takes a minute or two, but that probably wears you out quite a bit, and you only get one shot before a lengthy reload process." They kept moving, passing heavily reinforced walls and completely soundproof rooms. "But your instincts there were good. Keeping your enemies at bay for as long as possible is your best bet at being able to either defeat them outright, or give you enough time to make something that can shut them down." He stopped in front of a door with nothing but a target on it. "What's the simplest long-range weapon on the planet?" he asked. Momo thought for a second. "A spear? Or javelin?" Midoriya gave her a sideways nod. "Technically true, but again, only one use, and then you have to make another one." Momo frowned, but after another moment the realization struck her. "A bow?" He flipped open the binder, holding it open to a page where he'd drawn a crude, rudimentary recurve bow. "A bow," he said, almost bursting with excitement. "Over the millennia, materials and such have made it more and more complex, but it still comes down to the same basic design, a curved stick and a string." Momo looked at the drawing, and something about it just felt right. She'd never considered it before, but looking at it now, she was surprised she hadn't. "Bows are unbelievably versatile," he continued, flipping more pages. He turned the binder back around to show her two separate pages of arrow designs. Arrowheads can be tipped or customized in any number of ways. You could tip one with a paralyzing agent, or magnesium to create a fire, or fill one with nitroglycerin to make an explosive. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Momo found herself grinning like mad. "You could make one with the chemical compounds used in fire extinguishers. It can double as a bow staff, and... He paused for a breath. "And the best part," he said, "is that you are literally the only person on the planet who can pull this off. You don't have to worry about supply, because all you'll be making are small, thin s of wood or metal or whatever material you want to use. The arrowheads themselves would be the only complicated part." Momo looked to the drawing. Again, that feeling of rightness settled on her, but she shook her head at it. "I've never used a bow before," she said. "I wouldn't have any idea what I'm doing." "Well, neither would I, really," Midoriya said, pushing open the door with his back. Momo's eyes fell first upon the shooting range, with moving and stationary targets all on one side of the room. But then they fell on the figure leaning against the wall before them, a tall man covered by a red poncho, wearing leather chaps over blue jeans, spurs, a gas mask, and a cowboy hat with a metal plate resting on the brim. A stylized blackus was branded into the metal plate, and a revolver with an extended round chamber rested in a holster on his hip. "But that was why I made one of those phone calls this morning." "Mr. Snipe?" Momo asked, dumbfounded. "Took y'all long enough," Snipe said, tipping his hat to them. He pushed off from the wall and turned to face them. "Now then, how about we get started?" Izuku watched as Yaoyorozu took another shot. Wide left. "You're still changing your stance after each release," Snipe said, walking a circle around her. "And your elbow's too high when you draw back to you anchor point. Try again." Yaoyorozu sighed and drew back another arrow. Izuku could tell she was getting frustrated. Snipe hadn't given her any new information in a while. Izuku had stopped writing in his binder 5 minutes ago. She fired, and this time it was a little bit better. She actually managed to hit the target. "You've got to aim lower," Snipe said, gripping the lower limb of the bow and pulling it down. "Your eyes are telling you to point the arrow at the center of the target, right?" "Yes, sir," Yaoyorozu replied, her hands resting against the bow and its string. Snipe took up his own bow, nocked an arrow, and drew it back. "Makes sense. You want the arrow to hit the bullseye, so you point it at the bullseye." Izuku had his binder out again, writing furiously. On an adjacent page, he started drawing a picture of Snipe with his bow at the ready. "But look at where I'm actually aiming," Snipe continued. Yaoyorozu took a step around her instructor, so she could better see the placement of his arms. "Follow the line of the arrow. Do you see how high it is?" They looked together, Izuku climbing down from where he'd been perched on a stack of hay bales. Their faces almost pressed together to get a better view, and the sudden closeness ignited a fire in Izuku's cheeks. He did his best to ignore it, and the lavender scent of what he could only guess would have been her shampoo, and instead examined the arrow. It angled upward, not sharply, but the slant was akin to that of the rise at the base of a small mountain. "I didn't realize how far off I was," Yaoyorozu said. "It happens a lot when you're starting out," Snipe replied. "It's because your eyes are higher than the side of your mouth, which is pretty much where you're fearing from. It's a small difference, but when you're dealing with ranged weaponry, small mistakes become big ones real fast." Snipe fired the arrow, which struck high, about an inch to the side of where Yaoyorozu's had landed. "But if you can make those changes part of your muscle memory," he knocked and fired again quickly, with this second shot hitting true in the center of the target, "you've got a much better chance to hit what you're aiming at." Their teacher stepped to the side, allowing Yaoyorozu to take her position again. He circled her as she prepared, giving her a reminder about her stance, adjusting her arm as she drew back the bowstring. Izuku watched as she lowered the bow, though not as much as Snipe had. She released, and the arrow struck the target to the upper right of the center. "Yes," Yaoyorozu beamed, first at the target, then at Izuku. Her smile was bright and wide, reaching up to her eyes, and Izuku felt what was becoming a common warmth in his cheeks. "Well done," Snipe said. "Excellent improvement. You're a quick study, Miss Yaoyorozu." He reached out and took the upper arm of her bow, clipping something that resembled a two-tined fork onto it. "This should help you out a little more. It's called a marksman's sight, and it'll help you judge the distance between the arrow and your eyes." He tapped the accessory lightly with a finger. "In fact, this one was mine when I was first bow trainin'." Izuku's mouth fell open. "Mr. Snipe, you trained?" "Of course I did," Snipe replied. "Why wouldn't I?" The boy scratched the back of his neck. Well, I just assumed that, with your quirk, Snipe nodded. "Oh, I see," he said. He took up his bow again, slotting several arrows into the quiver on his hip. "Midoriya, with your fascination with quirks, I know you're aware that they're physical abilities. Quirk use takes the same energy from a body that running, jumping, swimming, anything like that would." An arrow knocked into the bowstring, and Snipe drew it back to his anchor point, next to the filter on his mask. "Mine's pretty tough on the muscles in my arms, wrists, and hands. Yes, my brain'll tell my body where to place my hands and when to pull the trigger, but my muscles have got to be in perfect sync. They have to use only a certain amount of pressure, both on themselves and on the weapon, in order to make a perfect shot." He released the arrow, and Izuku and Yaoyorozu watched as it hit the target, just to the left of center. He fired again, this one hitting just to the right of the first, in the bullseye. With a third shot, he hit centimeters lower than the first, still left of the center circle. Quirks are not the end-all, be-all of our abilities, Snipe said. We overuse them, and we'll get worn down till we're worse than useless. He turned to Yaoyorozu. You know what I mean, don't you? She nodded. Yes, sir, she said. My quirk uses the lipids in my body to build whatever I make. If I create too much without eating, I'll faint. Yaoyorozu neglected to add on what Izuku knew to be true. If she created too much without replenishing herself, she could die. Snipe looked back to Izuku. If all any pro relied on was their quirk, we'd all be in a heap of trouble, he said. Yes, most people in the world have quirks now, but we should never forget that we're still people too. He knocked another arrow. And people, he fired, struck true in the center of the bullseye, splitting his other arrow down the middle, can still do some pretty amazing things. Izuku stared at the split arrow, his mouth wide. Did you? He started. Snipe shook his head. I trained to be able to do that, he said. He removed the remaining 3 arrows from his quiver, and knocked them all together with a slight twist of the bowstring. So that when I need to be able to do this, he released them, and with a whistle the 3 arrows flew apart and struck the bullseyes of the other 3 targets in the room. It'll be easier. Yaoyorozu's bow clanked as it fell to the concrete floor, the material echoing through the concrete room. I could never, she started. Hey, Izuku gripped her arm. Don't get discouraged. It's your first day. She turned to look at him. The tears that had been welling in the bottom of her eyes died as she sucked in a heavy breath through her nose. Listen, Snipe said, leaning down to pick up her bow. I don't expect you to be able to group shots like that overnight. He handed it back to her, adjusting the marksman's sight on the upper arm again. All I expect is discipline and patience. Skill will come with practice. Yaoyorozu nodded and turned to the target. She readied her stance, nocked an arrow, and drew, kept her eye to the sight, released. The arrow sailed down the gallery and struck the target. 1 circle off from the center. She lowered the bow, and even though her eyes were focused on the target, Izuku could see the smile growing on her face. He didn't even try to stop his own. Great shot, Snipe said. Yaoyorozu turned to their teacher. Thank you, sir, she said, tucking an errant hair behind her ear. Don't thank me just yet, he said, pointing toward the target with the arm of his bow. Are you ready for the bad news? Izuku watched as the glow that had been growing on Yaoyorozu's face began to fade. Archery is a skill, Snipe continued. It will take you years, longer than you have left at this school, to master it, and that doesn't even include trying to work your quirk into it. Yaoyorozu's shoulders dropped, and she turned her face to the ground. Their teacher rested a hand on her shoulder. But, he said, Midoriya is right. With the way your quirk works, it'd be bad for you if a villain got too close. Just like me. Izuku smiled as Yaoyorozu turned her eyes toward him, and she returned it with a half-hearted grin of her own. And a gun, even a 6-shooter like mine, is still a pretty complex machine, especially if you're trying to build one from scratch, their teacher continued. So the bow really is your best bet. Yaoyorozu lifted her head and nodded. Now, then, Snipe said, turning toward the door, I'm not going to be able to train with you every day. I've got other students, after all, and my own hero work on top of all that. But, he opened the door, Izuku and Yaoyorozu heading through the opening before he closed it behind them. I think with all the notes he took today, and his pretty impressive insights into your quirk use, Midoriya here will make a perfect partner. Izuku fumbled his notebook at the mention of his name, the stammer in his voice tremulous. But, sir, I don't know anything about ranged weaponry. But you will, Snipe said, turning to him. Won't you? You were going to go back to the dorms and start researching. I will. Izuku felt his entire face heat up, and his hand started rubbing the back of his neck of its own accord. Yeah, I guess. Snipe nodded. Good, then, he said. This'll work out well for you two, Midoriya. I know you like to get up close and personal, but if a bad guy's trying to gun you down, knowing how to counter them could be just the edge you need. He clapped Izuku on the shoulder, then stepped past. Now, I've got some other work to do. Y'all get it done, but don't push yourselves too strong, okay? Yes, sir, they said together. And Yaoyorozu, Snipe said as he turned the hallway corner, don't forget what I said. All I expect is discipline and patience. The skill will come in time. She nodded, and their teacher tipped his hat to them before he was gone. The hall outside the gallery was silent, but for the hum of the air conditioning. Yaoyorozu stood facing the corner where Snipe had just disappeared, a hand still gripping the haft of her bow. Izuku scratched the back of his head, uncertain. His mouth opened to speak, but nothing emerged. Finally, he shuffled, and the squeak of his red shoes on the tile floor echoed through the empty hall like a gunshot. Oh, I'm sorry, Yaoyorozu said, turning. I was lost in thought. She took a step and bowed, both hands now holding the bow. I cannot thank you enough for this. It truly feels right. Izuku shook his head with vigor. You don't have to thank me, Yaoyorozu, he said. I just had an idea. Mr. Snipe's really the one who… Midoriya. Yaoyorozu's voice was stern. Her eyes closed as she cut him off. Please don't sell yourself short. You know I would never have thought to try archery without you. He took a step backward, looking down as he felt his cheeks warming. Besides, she continued, I think this partnership is going to work out quite well, don't you? Especially since I've thought of a great way to repay you. She seeked her head to the side, a sideways grin stretching across her lips. Are you interested? Izuku's head snapped up so strong, he felt a soreness in his neck. He looked left and right, as if expecting someone else to be there to tell him what to do. What? For a few moments, the only sound in the hallway was that of Midoriya's panicked breathing, and Momo found her smile deepening to match the blush growing on his cheeks. Until she realized the way she'd phrased her previous question, and her own panic set in. Oh my goodness, Midoriya, I'm so sorry, she said, the fingers of her free hand pressing over the oval of her open mouth. I didn't mean to, that is, I had no intention of. It's okay, Midoriya said, shaking his head. I understand. I know you didn't mean anything by it. He turned his eyes to the ground, and somewhere in the depths of her scent, Momo felt the pang of a harsher heartbeat, a vibration that ran up into her neck, causing her to swallow, then traveled to her face, pushing her eyebrows closer together. She did not like seeing him this way. It was an aspect of his personality that she always found herself questioning. He seemed to be willing to go to ludicrous lengths. His match with Todoroki at their first sports festival was proof enough to ensure that his classmates not only knew that he believed in them, but that they believed in themselves. It was probably the first time since my mom left that I'd thought about becoming a hero for my own sake, Todoroki had told her. I don't know if I can ever repay him for that. When it came to himself, though, Midoriya could barely accept the possibility of someone believing in him, much less their friendship, and for the longest time, Momo had trouble understanding why. Yesterday, however, had made the reason painfully clear. Learning that Midoriya had spent his youth having to live quirkless had been eye-opening. Even from her relative distance, Momo had been able to tell that Midoriya was quiet and reserved. He liked to keep to himself, and stepping out into the spotlight of hero work had been daunting for him. But now, Momo understood that flying under the radar like he had might have been the only way for him to make it through. More than likely, even if he or his family had tried to tell people he did have a quirk, the other kids wouldn't have believed him, and it would have just made things worse. Life was different for him now. Yes, he'd made friends with many of their classmates. Momo liked to think she was one of them, despite their not being as close as they could have been. But still, those strong ships must linger. Anyway, Midoriya said, lifting his eyes and giving her a light smile. You don't have to repay me, I'm just glad I could be helpful. And then there was this part, yet another of Midoriya's characteristics by which Momo was regularly baffled. An invulnerable kindness, one that could well be as strong as he was, and which was difficult to know just where it came from. They all knew Midoriya's favorite hero was All Might, and honestly, whose wasn't? But even All Might had basked in the spotlight and wealth of being number one. And from what little they'd learned about his home life, it didn't seem likely to have stemmed from there either. He'd spoken highly of his mother, but also mentioned how she could be overprotective at times. As for his father, all they knew was that he worked in America and had very little contact with his family. Midoriya just seemed born with the desire to help others. It was a trait Momo found herself admiring, resigning to adopt it more herself. At least give me a chance to show you what I've got in mind, Momo said. She turned her body, gesturing toward the door with her bow. His eyes followed down the hallway, glancing back down at his scuffling red shoes before nodding and saying, okay. They fell into stride beside each other, opening the doors together as they stepped back out into the central area of the gym. Momo felt the eyes on them as they made their way through, particularly on the bow she now carried slung across her back. She did her best to ignore the growing warmth on her face, and walked faster to the sparring mats on the far side. Midoriya followed close behind, reaching the sparring area only moments after Momo. So, Midoriya said, one hand idly scratching the back of his head, what's the plan? As she pulled her bow off her shoulders, Momo had to smile. When she'd initially made the offer, she didn't really have a clue on how to follow through with it. As they'd walked, however, she had decided to take a page out of Midoriya's book. Join me on the mat, if you would, she said, leaning the bow against a chair before gesturing to the circle in the center of the blue surface. He followed, though with hunched shoulders and a wrinkled brow. Momo crossed to the far end of the circle, stopping to face Midoriya as she reached the mark on her side. He stopped at his own, squaring off against her. "Now," she said, "I want you to hit me." His face paled, making the freckles that shaped his cheekbones even more prominent. He stammered, and Momo found a corner of her mouth turning upward. "You want me to what now?" Momo's grin deepened, and she shifted her stance, placing more of her weight on her forward foot, raising her upturned hands to uneven heights before her torso. "Hit me," she said. Midoriya's face paled even further, so much so that Momo became slightly concerned about the blood flow to his brain, but he readied himself into an approximation of a fighting stance. Okay, Yaoyorozu," he said, "if you're sure." "I'm sure," Momo replied. There was a shift in his demeanor. Then, his eyes closed and he sucked a breath up through his nose, and when they opened on the exhale they seemed almost a brighter shade of green, though there was no evidence of his quirk. Activating. His eyebrows pulled together, and his lips pressed into a thin line. It was a face she had seen several times before, and remembered fondly. It was his face of determination, of victory. And then, he stepped forward, seeked his arm back, and threw another painfully sloppy punch. Momo waited the half-breath it took for his weight to shift off balance before she turned her body. To Midoriya's credit, he'd kept his other hand close to his body, ready to defend against another strike. But with how he'd moved so carelessly, there was nothing he could do about Momo using his own momentum against him. She grabbed his wrist with one hand as she turned and used her other to grip around his elbow. Then, stepping into his body, she used her shoulder and hips to heave him off the ground, his own momentum causing him to crash onto his back. Midoriya looked up at her with wide upside-down eyes, a grimace over his features. He rolled over, having to push himself onto his knees before standing again. When he raised his head, his eyes were still wide, but the grimace had been replaced with upturned eyebrows and a smile. "What was that?" he asked. "That was amazing." A grin pressed at her own cheeks, and Momo felt herself having to suppress it. "I did mention that I've been training in several different martial arts, did I not? Aikido, judo, karate." "You did," Midoriya said, his green waves bobbing up and down. "But what made you think it?" "I think I remember you using a throw like this yourself at some point." Momo found her smile drifting. "But well," she said, turning her eyes to the floor, "it was when you hit the punching bag earlier?" Midoriya's smile dipped, and his head turned slightly to the side. "Well, Momo continued, a corner of her bottom lip pulling from between her teeth. "You have quite a bit of raw power, obviously, but you don't have much technique." His face dropped further, but lifted quickly in a small smile. "That's true, you're not wrong," he said, his grin fading some as he glanced down at the mat. "I've been in plenty of fights, even before coming to UA, but I've never really been trained." "There was also something Mr. Snipe said," Momo said as she helped Midoriya back to his feet. "About how learning to shoot made using his quirk easier." She looked down at the hand in her own, at the scarring there. "I know you've been worried about the toll your quirk can take on your body." Midoriya lifted his hand out of hers, slipping the whole arm behind his back. "And I just thought, well," she paused, taking a breath to steady her mind and her words. "I thought if you had better technique, you wouldn't need to use as much power." He frowned, pinching the bottom of his chin. "It sounds like a good idea," he said after a moment. "But how would better fighting skills help me against someone who's super strong?" "You mean like the villain you fought when we were in the woods?" Midoriya nodded. "I'm sure there will be times when you'll need to use your power," she said, waving a hand. "But consider this, if you had had the technique to render his muscles useless, or to turn his own strength and momentum against him, do you think you would have needed to use as much power as you did?" He turned away from her, fingers still holding his chin. Momo began to worry he was going to decline until she heard a stream of muttered benefits coming from his general direction. "Okay," he turned back around, his face practically glowing with a smile. "I'd be happy to learn some fighting techniques from you, if you're willing to teach me." Momo smiled in tandem and held out her hand. "So, it's a deal. Then, you'll help me study archery and long-range skills, and in return I'll teach you some hand-to-hand combat techniques." Midoriya reached out and took her hand with his own, the scars on either side smooth beneath Momo's thumb and fingers. "Deal." "Excellent," she said. "Shall we get started?" The sky was orange as they exited the gym. "This is so much more intense than I thought," Midoriya said. Momo held the door open for him, as his arms were full with a second binder she'd created for him, along with all the paper he'd used to take notes on her instructions. "I can't wait to get back to the dorm and really dive into what you've shown me." "Well, the same goes for me," she said, a laugh slipping through. May I? She reached for the first notebook, but he pulled back, fumbling the items in his hands. He stammered, his hands slipping about trying to hold on to everything. I think I should probably keep these for now, just so I can sift through them. One of the binders fell out of his grasp completely, but he managed to catch it with his foot. My notes can look pretty jumbled. I should probably organize them and make them a little more legible. Momo just kept her hand out. Midoriya, she said, her voice dropping half an octave. I think I'm more than capable of decoding your handwriting. I wouldn't worry. He paled, but handed the binder over. Momo took it with grace and a smile, but found herself curious about his reaction. Certainly he couldn't have been that embarrassed of his penmanship. Part of her found the urge to open it right away almost overwhelming. It was one of Midoriya's notebooks, after all, even if it technically was one he made especially for her. But as they walked back to the dorms, the same silence from the night before crept over them. Midoriya, Momo asked. Why did you want to become a hero? A startled sound came from him, but Momo hadn't been looking right away. When she turned to him, he'd straightened his posture, and a hand was scratching at the back of his head. Because of All Might, he said, the hand in his hair coming back around. I figured everybody knew that. Momo gave a light laugh. I did, she said, but I was wondering, with the way your quirk worked, what made you believe you could? His head tilted back, and he gave a nod. Right, he said, his voice trailing off for a second. Well, to be honest, I didn't know if I could or not. The first time I tried to use my quirk again was at the entrance exam. She gaped at him. Wait a minute, you mean to tell me you walked into the UA Hero course entrance exam without even knowing if your quirk would destroy your body or not? Pretty much, he replied with a laugh. My thought process was basically, my arm didn't fly off when I was a kid, and my body is much bigger and stronger now than it was back then. I hadn't even stopped to consider how my quirk had gotten stronger along with my body. His face turned pensive, and he cast it down toward the ground. And, obviously, I wasn't ready. I broke my arm and both my legs in the one use I got out of my power. The only reason I got in at all was because I saved your Araka from that giant robot. Momo's mind reeled. She always knew Midoriya had to be some kind of crazy to even try, much less get into, a hero course with a quirk his body couldn't handle. But to have not even known. That seems, she started. Crazy, he finished for her. Yeah, I thought the same thing, believe me. But I had to try. All Momo could do was shake her head and smile. That determination was one of the things that made her seek him out, after all. What about you? He asked. What made you want to become a hero? It wasn't a question she'd had to answer very often. She'd gotten into the school on a recommendation. Yes, she'd still had to take an exam, but from what she understood from her classmates, hers wasn't nearly as intensive or challenging as theirs. And once they were all in school together, the question never came up in conversation. They all knew what they were there to do. They wanted to be heroes. The reasons seemed almost arbitrary. Midoriya was the first one to ask her. Well, she said, gravel crunching beneath their feet as they walked. I imagine it's because of my parents. He nodded. That makes sense. Your father started one of the biggest support item companies in the country. Momo felt again the thrum of her heartbeat. I didn't realize you knew that, she said. It's not as though our name is on the front door. She watched as his freckles turned a shade pinker, and he tucked his chin down into his Saint. Well, no, he said, his voice softer than before, but Alchemy Solutions has been supporting heroes for decades. Dozens of pros, top to bottom, use your father's company for their equipment. Her eyes turned to him, and found his smile bright, contrasted by the darkness of his hair against the oranges and purples of the dusk behind him. With all my hero research, I was bound to come across your father's work sometime, wasn't I? A smile crept its way up the sides of her face. I suppose that's true, she said. Oh, I'm sorry, Midoriya said. His scarred hand dove into the green hair behind his head, scratching. I guess I didn't really give you a chance to answer my question, did I? Momo laughed again. It's all right, she said, the laugh dissolving back into a smile. It's actually funny that you brought it up. My parents met at my father's company. They did? He asked. Oh wait, stars lit up in Midoriya's eyes, and new life was breathed into his entire body, despite the hours of training they had just completed. Your mom wasn't a hero, was she? But wait, I don't remember any heroines with a quirk like yours, and besides that she would have had to have worked with your father's company, which narrows it down even further and… You don't have to guess, she said, her laughter cutting short his rambling. No, my mother wasn't a hero. She attended the business course here at UA. Midoriya's face pinched together for a half-second. The business course? Momo nodded, giving a light hum of affirmation. My father had a good idea for a support company, but he didn't know anything about the minutiae of running a business. He met my mother at a conference not long after she graduated, and they struck up a conversation, wherein she proposed several ideas on how he could better operate his business. So then they became partners, he asked. Well, not right away, Momo said. My father was a little stubborn. But once he saw they were barely breaking even, despite being licensed to use his quirk, he decided to listen to her advice. Midoriya's eyebrows nearly shot into the stratosphere. His quirk? Momo nodded again. It's where the name of the company came from, she said. Alchemy. He pinched his chin. It must be similar to yours, he said. They approached the doors to their dorms, and Midoriya paused for a moment to open one for her. Can I ask how it works? She was about to answer, but as she stepped through the door, Momo was accosted by several of their classmates, all of whom were latching onto the bow slung across her shoulder. Yeah, Momo, Mina shouted. This bow is so awesome. I didn't know you studied archery too. Well, I don't really. That is, I've really just started. This is really killer, Momo, Kyoka said. Was this your idea, Midoriya? Momo looked over to him, and saw Midoriya's face burning. I mean, I guess, but I was really just working with. What an excellent insight, Midoriya, Ida said, clapping a hand on his friend's shoulder. I can see the ideology so clearly. This will give her a significant edge in combat while minimizing the drain on her resources. It won't work. Midoriya's mouth paused mid-response, as the whole class turned to look at Bakugo, who was sitting on the sofa, his back turned to them. Leave it to Bakugo to blow up a good time, Kirishima said, leaning against the back of the couch. Yeah, you don't have to be so negative, man, Kaminari said. Shut up, Bakugo's voice carried through the high ceilings of the dorms. Ponytail wants to use one of Deku's stupid ideas, that's her call. A sudden sharpness shot its way up from Momo's heart to the bottom of her throat, and without thinking she stepped forward, parting her classmates. I certainly wouldn't be the one calling Midoriya's ideas stupid if I were you, Bakugo, she said, the venom in her voice a surprise even to her. It was his strategic assessment and quick thinking that got us our provisional licenses, but I guess you wouldn't remember that, would you? The aluminum can Bakugo had been drinking from exploded in a miniature mushroom cloud as he snapped up from the sofa, the spikes of his ash-blonde hair threatening to scratch her nose as he whipped around to face her. What the hell did you just say to me? Tiny explosions popped around his fingers as he held up his hand. I'll take you on right now and prove how pointless your new little strategy is. Momo didn't even flinch. Yes, that'd be a fair fight. Me, who just started learning this skill today, against you, who've been perfecting fighting with your quirk since. She caught the words in her throat before they could get out. Her eyes darted to Midoriya, whose face bore an expression that seemed like a mixture of worry and anger. It hadn't taken long for some in their class to figure out Bakugo had been bullying Midoriya while the two were in school together. Herself, Ida, Todoroki, a few others. They had agreed to keep this knowledge to themselves, firstly because of a lack of evidence other than their own observations, and secondly for Midoriya's sake. Revealing it to the rest of the class would do nothing but embarrass him, and the school wouldn't be able to do anything without solid, tangible proof. So they kept their mouths shut. But the knowledge that it had happened was something that had always colored Momo's perception of Bakugo, especially now, learning that he'd grown up believing Midoriya to be quirkless. Heroes don't do what he did. Well, much longer than a day, she finished, some of the energy drawn out of her voice, though her eyes never left Bakugo's. You can take all the time you want, Bakugo replied, his voice low and full of cold fire. You'll never beat me. He hooked a thumb toward Midoriya. I'll bet Deku's dumb strategy counts on you being defensive, right? Using arrows to keep villains away from you until you figure out something you can make to stop them. Momo swallowed strong. So tell me, Ponytail, he continued, his nose centimeters from her own, what are you going to pull out of your bag when you go up against somebody who isn't afraid of some sharpened sticks? A bead of sweat ran down her back, but Momo held her ground, her eyes never moving from Bakugo's, until a mop of green hair blocked her view. That's enough, Kekken, Midoriya said, his voice low and purposeful. Momo wasn't sure how he'd managed to enter what little space lay between herself and Bakugo, until she felt his elbow brushing against her arm. She looked down to see his palm pressed into the other boy's Saint. Bakugo scoffed, but backed away from them, his eyes shifting from disdain to indifference. Whenever you're ready, he said, I'll be happy to show you just how useless Deku's strategy is. He turned and walked away, toward the elevator leading back to their bedrooms. The tension that had filled the air dispelled with Bakugo's departure, but the dour mood he'd placed over them lingered. Their classmates split from the group as though they'd been repelled, with excuses of, I think I left the water running, or I've still got some studying to do. Sato claimed to remember a baking pan of brownies he'd forgotten about which, if legitimate, probably did need to be addressed. In less than a minute the entire class had departed, save for Midoriya and Momo herself. I'm sorry about that, Midoriya said, still facing where Bakugo had been standing on the other side of the sofa. He'd tucked his arms into themselves, Momo noticed, almost as though he were trying to give himself a hug. I'm sure Kaken was just saying we needed to keep thinking it through. He turned, his face a mask of a large smile and pinched eyes. He did kind of have a point about fighting villains who wouldn't be bothered by your arrows after all, and besides. As Midoriya began to pace the room with another of his mumbled streams of thought, Momo marveled at the hoops he was willing to jump through in order to make Bakugo's actions seem altruistic. He wasn't the only one, of course. The judges during the second half of their provisional licensing exam had gone through frankly wild leaps of logic in order to ascribe positive motivations to Bakugo simply yelling at them to help themselves. But the fact that Midoriya, someone whom she knew had suffered at Bakugo's hands, was willing to believe that Bakugo's behavior held some kind of twisted benevolence, it either spoke to Midoriya's bottomless well of optimism or Bakugo's intense ability to manipulate. Either way, it wasn't a situation Momo was equipped to address at the moment. She and Midoriya weren't close, she and Bakugo even less so. She expected she would grow closer with Midoriya, they would be training together, after all, and people who spend time together naturally start to form a bond. Perhaps as time passed she would feel more comfortable discussing his relationship with Bakugo, but for now, she decided to leave the matter be. Instead, she tapped Midoriya on the shoulder as he paced by, snapping the string of words that never seemed to stop when he got into this state. When did you take time to breathe? Midoriya, she said, a light laugh escaping as he startled so strong he jumped. Oh, I'm sorry, Yaoyorozu, he said, his voice tremulous. No need to apologize, she replied. But listen, I'm not worried about what Bakugo said. I think archery is a fine strategy. But what about, he started. Momo shook her head to cut him off. Every quirk has limitations, she said. Would Sue be able to assist in a fire rescue? Or one in the Arctic? Not very effectively, Midoriya said. The fire would dry her out, and the cold would put her to sleep almost right away. Exactly, Momo said. But put her in or around water, and she's a true force. I doubt either Bakugo or yourself would have a chance of defeating her in the water. Midoriya smiled, his eyes turning to the ground. You're probably right about that. So I'm not worried about Bakugo's opinion, Momo continued. There will always be villains or situations in which using a bow will be limited or ineffective altogether. Momo reached out and lifted Midoriya's chin from his CH-scent, forcing him to look in her eyes. But I believe in your assessment. Learning archery negates many of my quirk's drawbacks while simultaneously giving me the best chance against the largest variance of opponents. Midoriya's face was on fire, and Momo could feel the heat steaming off of her own cheekbones, but she needed him to know how serious she was. She tried not to notice his vibrant eyes. He backed away from her, but his eyes never left hers. The hand that had been beneath his chin lowered to grip the notebook he'd given her. Thank you, Yaoyorozu, he said, his head bowing again. For your confidence in me. I promise, I'll try not to let you down. I've never doubted that, Midoriya, Momo replied, bowing in kind. Now, it's getting close to supper time, and I'd like to get a shower and some rest before we eat. Midoriya looked at his shirt, seeming to notice for the first time just how much sweat had soaked through it. Yeah, he said, pulling the shirt away from his body with his finger and thumb. That's probably a good idea. Momo headed to the girls' side elevator, while Midoriya started up the stairs on the opposite end, as his room was only one floor up. She watched him go, and saw his eyes turn toward her as the elevator doors began to close. He looked for a split second before his head snapped back forward, and he started to run. The elevator rose, and Momo shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. What she needed now was focus. She had an entire new skill to try to master. She stepped out onto the 5th floor hallway, which she shared only with Sue, so Momo was surprised to find another of the girls there. Ochako, Momo said, readjusting the bow on her shoulder. What brings you up here? Waiting for Tsu. The girl's brown hair swished side to side as she shook her head. No, Ochako replied. I wanted to see how your training went with Deku. Did he have any good ideas for you? He did, actually, Momo said, tilting her head and lifting her shoulder to indicate the bow. And I would be happy to tell you about them, but at the moment I'm rather sweaty and tired, and could really use at least a shower before supper. Ochako's eyes darted away for a split second. Oh, sure, yeah, Momo, I'll see you later. She walked to the elevator, rocking back and forth on her heels as she waited for the car. Momo entered her dorm room, setting the bow down to rest on the doorframe. Her fingers grazed the bowstring as she pulled them away. With a heavy breath pulling through her nose, she shook her head to clear the cobwebs and set the notebook Midoriya had given her on the desk. She took off her jacket, draping it along the back of her desk chair, and let the cooler air of her bedroom chill her sweat-soaked skin. She started toward her bathroom to turn on her shower, but glanced again at the cover to Midoriya's notes for her, and that same curiosity reared its head. I suppose flipping through it briefly couldn't hurt, Momo said to herself. Noting that somehow the edges of the pages were already frayed, Momo took care when opening the cover. Much to her chagrin, no demons flew forth from the contents of the binder, nor did her face melt away. Instead there simply sat a piece of paper, notes scribbled on almost every white millimeter, a nearly imperceptible mosaic of kanji. From what she could decipher at a glance, this was Midoriya's brainstorming. It appeared to detail his thoughts regarding her quirk, starting with known function, moving to hypothesized capabilities, to combat integration. It was truly astounding. Page after page of highly educated guesswork, the fact that Midoriya had done all this in one night. She flipped another page to find the word quirkless at the top, encircled heavily. Here began a series of comparisons between herself and other heroes who have similar limitations, including their homeroom teacher, Eraserhead. Turning another, she found a series of 3 columns: complexity, resources, and effectiveness. Here Midoriya had begun the process of narrowing down items and weaponry. He'd considered dozens of options, from firearms to spears, slings to mortars, swords to cannons, and in the center of each column, he'd written and heavily circled bow. What followed were the pages Momo had already seen. Once settling on archery, it seemed Midoriya's imagination devoted itself wholeheartedly to that course. Page after page of customizable arrowheads, potential materials, different types of fletching. When did he sleep? Momo said, both her exhaustion and desire to bathe long forgotten. Turning another page, she found a drawing of Snipe from their training that morning. Up to this point, all of the drawings in the binder had been essentially diagrams, heavily detailed, and much more useful for when she would actually begin attempting to make the items, but lacking artistic depth. This drawing, however, Momo had never known that Midoriya had such a talent for art. Even this simplistic sketch conveyed something more than just a picture of their teacher with a bow drawn. There was a vibrancy to the figure. She could feel the tension in his arm as he held the nocked arrow, feel the strength in his arms as he surpassed the draw weight. She had to give Midoriya credit. He certainly always seemed to be full of. Oh. Momo had flipped the next page, the last of those that had been written upon or drawn upon. In this case, it was a picture of her, in her hero costume, the winter version, with the cloak. She was posed in dynamic fashion. She was dodging something, with one leg hyperextended and smoke filling the background. Her cloak billowed behind her, flying with the flow of her motion, but her body was twisting as she dodged, turning toward wherever the phantom projectile had come from. She was readying her bow, pulling it from the section of her torso she left exposed, one hand already on the grip. With the other she was already knocking an arrow by, creating it out of her palm. Momo rose and grabbed the bow she'd left leaning against the doorframe. She held it in the ready stance Snipe had shown her, then pictured what she wanted to create in her mind. A simple arrow, plastic nock and fletching, hollow aluminum, steel bullet point arrowhead. Next, she envisioned that item traveling from her mind down to where she wanted it to emerge, near the base of her fingers, in this case. A spot on her palm, just below the meeting point of her index and middle fingers, started to glow a soft white. Finally, she raised the bow as Snipe had instructed her to, and began pulling back the bowstring. At the same time, she pictured the completed arrow springing from the spot in her hand. She felt the energy for her creation drain from her, and the arrow flew from her palm, as though it knew it was no longer supposed to be a part of her. The bullet point arrowhead slid perfectly onto the shelf on the grip, and Momo managed to catch the nock between her index and middle fingers as it tried to fly past them. The entire creation process had taken about 1/10 of a second. The result was an arrow that was nocked and ready to fire in about half a second. Momo lowered the bow, letting the string go slack, and raised the arrow she'd just made. The energy to make it had been negligible. She imagined the only reason she'd felt it at all was due to her pre-existing exhaustion. The arrow itself was simple, dark green plastic fletching, white, metallic steel arrowhead. Nothing special. And yet, Momo found herself wanting to find somewhere special for it to go. Severely lacking wall space due to the many floor-to-ceiling bookcases she had taking up those spaces, Momo decided to leave the arrow on her desk for now. She would make a plinth of some kind to put it on later. For now, she still needed to get that shower. Momo took one final look at Midoriya's drawing. At the level of detail he'd put into her face, her features, the sheer energy he'd given the drawing, the care he'd put into it. and she smiled. It was certainly something special.